Hello everybody, this is David. Welcome back to my channel. Well, this is the next in our series, The Christian Ethic in the 21st Century, and we're currently looking at the cradle of the Christian ethic. We're looking at the Judaism, which is the Judeo part of the Judeo-Christian ethic, which is what our culture is built upon. We're trying to investigate what it is. So we've been looking at it, and we got to the point where we're going to be looking at now at the Jewish insistence on the connection between religion and ethics, or ways of behaving. So our behaviour is closely connected to our religious beliefs. Now, this may seem to be obviously true, but it was not a truism in the ancient world. We can see this connection in two things. Firstly, one of the widespread practices in the ancient world was that of temple prostitution. The ancient peoples were fascinated by what we might call the life force. What makes the corn grow, and the grapes, and the olives ripen? Above all, how do children happen? What begets a child? This is the life force. So they worship the life force. But if you worship the life force, then the act of sexual intercourse can become an act of worship. And so temples in the ancient world had hundreds and sometimes thousands of priestesses attached to them who were nothing more than temple prostitutes. Now, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, verses 17-18, we read, "There shall be no cult prostitute of the daughters of Israel, neither shall there be a cult prostitute of the sons of Israel. You shall not bring the hire of a harlot or the wages of a dog," that is, a male prostitute, "into the house of the Lord your God, in payment for any vow. For both of these are an abomination to the Lord your God." Wow. So what on earth has the price of a prostitute to do with the temple of the gods? Well, in Greece, everything in the temple at Corinth, there were 1,000 sacred prostitutes, and they came down to the streets in the evening and plied their trade. Now, in Greece, Solon was the first Greek statesman. He was the first Greek statesman to institute public brothels, and with the profits of them they built a temple to the goddess Aphrodite. So the ancient world saw nothing wrong with this. Chastity and religion, or purity and religion, had no connection. Judaism for the first time made religion and purity go hand in hand. Now, the second thing that Judaism insisted on was that the most elaborate ritual and the most magnificent church services cannot take the place of the service of our fellow men. What does God want? The prophet asks. And the answer is not church services, but to share your bread with the poor, to take the homeless into your house, to feed the naked, to do justice and to love mercy is what God wants us to do, as we read in the book of Isaiah, chapter 1, verses 12-17, and chapter 58, verses 6-12, and also in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 7, verses 8-10, and in the book of Amos, chapter 5, verses 21-24. So Judaism insists that there can be no religion without ethics, and that to serve God we must serve our fellow men. Now, as Micah had it, you can come to God to offer him calves a year old, you can offer him thousands of rams, you can offer him tens of thousands of rivers of oil, you can even take your own child, fruit of your own body, and offer him. But not one of these things is what God wants. The only real offering is to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God, as we read in the book of Micah chapter 6 verses 6-8, and in the book of Hosea chapter 6 verse 6. So once and for all, the Old Testament unites religion and ethics, and it did so permanently and so well that today no one would ever regard a religion as a religion at all unless it joined the service of God and the service of men. So before we look at some of the details of the Old Testament ethic, there are two other general things that we ought to be looking at, that we ought to notice, that we ought to think of. Firstly, the Old Testament is not in the least bit afraid of the reward motive. The Old Testament is quite insistent that the prosperity of a nation is in direct ratio to its obedience to God. Given obedience to God, the rains will fall and the harvest will be sure, and there will be victory over their enemies. And given disobedience to God, the national life will fall apart. As we read in the book of Leviticus chapter 26, the book of Deuteronomy 28, and the book of Leviticus chapter 5, 18 and 19, and a few other places. Now there are two things to be said. Firstly, the Old Testament had little or no belief in any life to come, no afterlife, and therefore it had to promise its reward in this life. This is one of the differences that Christianity made. It brought in a new world to redress the balance of the old. Second, there is a real sense in which the Old Testament prophets were right. This much is true. There is not a problem threatening this or any other country just now, which is not a moral problem. It's incredible, really. It's the second fact to note, and again to this we will return, is that the prophets were politicians. The prophets were not talkers, they were doers. They were quite clear that the only way to turn the vision into fact was through political action. The prophets were the best friends of the poor man and the biggest scourges of the rich man. Pego, the philosopher, said, and I quote, "Everything begins in mysticism and ends in politics." End of quote. Of course, a man must have the vision of a perfect society. The demand of the prophet was, all right, you've had the vision, what are you doing about it? So let's have a look at some of the details. Firstly, the supreme characteristic of the Old Testament ethic is its comprehensiveness, or its detail, or its thoroughness. It involved every person and covered every action. One of the most extraordinary demands of God to the Jews was, as we read in the book of Exodus chapter 19 verse 6, you must be a kingdom of priests. Goodness or religion was not the business of a few experts. It was everyone's business. Everyone needed to be involved. A poet wrote a poem about Judea, in which he said that all Judea was, and I quote, pregnant with the living God. The writer of Ecclesiastes, the preacher, said in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 11, he has set eternity in their hearts. So all of life came within the command and the service of God. So secondly, within the family, parents were to be honoured, as we read it in the book of Exodus chapter 20 verse 12. To strike or to hit a parent was to deserve the death penalty, as we read in Exodus chapter 21 verse 15 and Deuteronomy chapter 21 verses 18 to 21. Now it has to be said, in the ancient world, honour of parents as a duty was built into life. The Babylonian code, the code of Hammurabi, has as the penalty for striking a parent that a man's hand should be cut off And Plato said that the punishment for such a crime was permanent banishment and death if the transgressor returned. That was his Laws 881. Cicero said that Solon, the greatest of the Greek lawgivers, did not legislate for the eventuality of a man striking a parent, for he believed that it was inconceivable that it should ever happen. So purity and chastity stood very high. The ideal of marriage was high, but the practice did not reach the ideal, and we'll look at a bit more of that later. So thirdly, there is one very notable thing in Jewish law. The law was specially designed to protect the widow and the fatherless and the poor, for they were held to be specially dear to God, as we read in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 10 verse 18 and Leviticus chapter 19 verse 15. But here is the special thing. The Jews insisted that there must be one law for everyone, the same for the Jew and the resident alien within their gates, as we read in the book of Leviticus chapter 24 verse 22. Now, there are two things about a Jew which together make an amazing paradox. The Jew never forgets that he is one of the chosen people. He will not intermingle with the Gentile, but at the same time, no nation ever more firmly banished racism from their society. No matter who a man was, justice was his because God cared for him. Now I'm going to stop the video here. We'll look at a few more details of the Jewish ethic in the next video. So I want to thank you for joining me in this video. See you next time. Bye bye.